Welcome to the Expert Series, where we explore the issues shaping Canadian national security and defense. I'm Josh Mulm, Director of Research and Analysis for the CDA Institute. Today, Xavier Delgado of the Wilson Center's Canada Institute is back on the program to discuss the latest in the Canada-U.S. bilateral relationship. Xavier is also a junior fellow with the CDA Institute. Today, we'll discuss everything that's happened in the U.S.-Canada relationship since Trump's inauguration back in January, which is the last time Xavier was on the program. So we'll discuss U.S. tariffs and the ongoing trade war, the resurgence we've seen in Canadian national pride, and how rising nationalism in Canada is shaping the political landscape, including the potential political shift due to tariff disputes, challenges in diversifying trade, Canada's new Prime Minister in the upcoming elections, as well as defense procurement and military sovereignty, including the debates over Canada's decision to purchase military equipment from the U.S., the reliability of the U.S. as an ally, and the importance of Canada's defense independence. This is the Expert Series. Hi, everyone, and thanks for tuning in again to another episode of the CDA Institute's Expert Series. I'm Josh Malm, Director of Research and Analysis with the CDA Institute. Today, I'm joined by Xavier Delgado, who is with the Canada Institute over at the DC-based Wilson Center. He's also a junior fellow at the CDA Institute. Xavier, it's great to have you on the podcast once again.
Josh, it's always a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
A particularly important time to have you on, I think, because of the work that you do at the Wilson Center's Canada Institute. You know, given all the developments lately in the Canada-U.S. relationship, I think it really just underscores the importance of dialogue between organizations like the CDA Institute, and I think it really underscores the importance of the work done by organizations like the Wilson Center, because this is a time when our countries need to keep talking, and we need dialogue more than ever. Uh, you've probably heard the phrase, there are decades where nothing happens, and there's weeks where decades happen. Well, I feel like the past few weeks, so much has happened in our bilateral relationship. I think we last spoke on January 24th, and that feels in some ways kind of worlds away now. So I'm hoping over the course of the next 25 to 30 minutes, we can discuss what's happened since then, what's happening in the Canada-U.S. relationship, tariffs, our bilateral trade, defense cooperation, and the fact that we're soon to have an election and we have a new prime minister here in Canada. Zabby, I guess I'll put it with you to start. The inauguration was on 24th of January, 2025. What's happened since, and what is the status of the bilateral relationship at present?
Well, it's a great question, Josh. And you're right. The last time we talked about the bilateral relationship was right after President Trump's inauguration. I don't think it's controversial to say that the relationship has deteriorated over the past 2.5 months, or sorry, no, just under 2 months at this point. It's been challenging for Canada and for the United States. There are major disagreements. Public sentiment has gone from hopeful optimism that the issues that Canada and the United States worked through during the first Trump administration, whether it be, yes, tariffs, which were around back then, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which was renegotiated into the USMCA, even other just pillars of bilateral cooperation that we established in that first administration would hold firm in the second one, and that just hasn't been the case. We're seeing uh, some major issues and fissures between Canada and the United States playing out very publicly. Not to mention comments that question Canada's sovereignty and challenge its status as an independent nation, whether it be calling the Prime Minister governor, whether it be saying Canada should be the 51st state. All of this plays into a relationship that has turned quite toxic over the course of just over 50 days. And if you told me back then that in about 2 months' time, most Canadians would see the United States not as an ally, but as a potential adversarial or competitive nation, I would have thought you were crazy. But it's just, like you said, weeks where it feels like decades have happened, and we are just in that sort of period where a lot of change is happening all at once.
And it feels like at this juncture, we're kind of just scratching the surface and just beginning to dive into in what sometimes feels like a bit of a new world. I was going to leave the conversation about annexation until a little later in the conversation, but maybe it would be good just to address this right out of the gate. From your perspective, maybe the perspective of your colleagues, and what is Mr. Trump getting at with these remarks about annexation? Even a few weeks ago, or just over a month ago when we spoke, he had not yet implemented tariffs and said the tariffs were going to be related to fentanyl and then border security, which may very well be a valid concern for the United States. But we've since shifted very much to more of a conversation about Canada becoming the 51st state, and that's how Canada can keep the tariffs off. Canada will be tariff free if we become a state. Y you know, we'll keep it open-ended here, but, is there any calculation behind this? Is it bluster? What's your read on, Mr. Trump?
Well, part of the challenge there, Josh, is that there's only one man who really knows what those comments are about and what the motivation behind them are, and he sits in the Oval Office, and he benefits from having an information space where there isn't a lot of clarity on what he means by that. He likes to keep the people that he's negotiating with guessing, and so it's anyone's best guess what they mean. I will say, I think it's really interesting that in Canada, these are being perceived as legitimate threats to Canadian sovereignty. We heard the Prime Minister say multiple times on a hot mic incident, but then his team came out more publicly saying that the Trump administration really does want to annex Canada, that they want to renegotiate the border between Canada and the United States, and that these are genuine feelings that the administration holds that they should be pushing to take Canadian territory. But if you look down south of the border, Josh, if you look across here in Washington, these comments aren't really being taken at face value. They're really being seen as a negotiating tactic. I think part of that is being perceived by, yes, the Republicans and the White House and the people around the Trump administration, but even to a degree, the folks across the aisle with the Democrats, Senator Tim Kaine, during the confirmation hearing for Trump ambassador to Canada, Pete Huckstra's confirmation hearing the other day, made reference to the comments about the 51st state, saying, I don't know if this is the president's negotiation tactic or if this is legitimate grievances that he's holding against Canada. But all to say, this is being taken much more seriously in Canada, completely understandably, than it is here in Washington. And I think that's a really interesting dynamic as well. When you look at the Canadian response to the situation versus the US response, which has been much less one of responding to a crisis and much more one of trying to negotiate a better agreement with our northern neighbors.
Zavi, so that's a great point you bring up. You're kind of illustrating maybe a gap between how Canadians are thinking and feeling about these calls for annexation versus how some of the administration are and some across the United States are. Obviously, America's a big country. Obviously, within the Trump administration, there are different factions and ideologies. But is it safe to say that maybe some Americans and some in the administration aren't necessarily quite aware of exactly how Canadians are feeling right now?
I think it's fair to say, but it goes to a challenge that we've talked about before, Josh, which is that Americans oftentimes don't think about Canada. It's And again, understandably, if you're a lawmaker or a policymaker here in the United States, you have a lot to worry about. The world always demands America's attention, and there's a tendency to focus on areas of crisis, which is traditionally, Europe, in the Indo-Pacific, in the Middle East. Not usually Canada, although I think you could make the case to say that where Canada's relations are in a crisis moment at this time. But there's been this chronic lack of attention towards Canada in the United States. We're seeing that play out right now, where I think there's a misperception on the US side of how the situation is being perceived in Canada. But it also goes to the fact that a lot of Americans don't really understand the extensive trade ties between the two countries. They don't understand the history behind the security and defense relationship, and they certainly don't understand the cultural ties unless if you live across along one of the border states, just how much the two countries exchange with each other on a daily basis. So all of this lack of knowledge feeds into this situation where we're in right now, where I think a lot of Americans are learning for the first time just how deep this bilateral relationship goes.
It really feels hard to predict the future at this juncture, but your point there that Americans might be seeing or realizing for the first time the depth of our bilateral relationship. Is it possible that prevails in all of this? That in the short term, perhaps there will be a bit of pain, and maybe we come to our senses and enough with the tariffs, and we try to get on with USMCA renegotiation and try to ameliorate any concerns about our trade relationship and move forward, or does this pivot towards the use of tariffs and this kind of economic strategy? Does it potentially have a bit more? Is there longevity there? Is this a new way that America is viewing the world?
Well, I think we have to read that between the headlines a little bit here, Josh, and just come to the conclusion that it probably won't be 100% one or the other. It's going to end up somewhere in between. If you look at the Trump administration's policies and their rhetoric, yes, there are specific grievances that they have, but it points to a larger dissatisfaction with how the bilateral relationship, and indeed many of America's bilateral relationships around the world are currently being conducted, and the genuine belief that the United States has been taken advantage of by its global allies and partners for the better part of the past few decades. So these are all things um, that I don't think are resolved easily, even if the tariffs go away. But it's something that will continue to be a challenge, regardless of what happens in the course of the next year, 2 years, 4 years. We have to remember that of a significant number of voters, in fact, the second largest popular vote count in history, sent Donald Trump and his administration to the White House for a second time, which means that this sentiment, even if it's not shared amongst all 77 million of those voters, is shared by a predominant number of them. And if we look at the historical trend, we're seeing actually a lot of sentiment around America that globalization has not been working for the United States. That the United States' trade relations with allies, yes, in North America, but also around the world, have not been benefiting the United States. These these are large structural problems that don't just go away with an administration. We're going to have to reckon with them at some point, and that's going to be a long-term challenge for for countries like Canada.
So, Zavi, thanks for that. I'm hoping that we can dive a bit into some of the specifics of the tariffs. What tariff measures has the United States imposed on Canada? Can you reflect on Canada's response a bit? And where does this leave our economic relationship going forward?
Well, we've been through a number of rounds with tariffs now. We had the initial threat at the start of February that was hunted down the line because of Canada's response to the United States' concerns about fentanyl and border security. And then we had the actual March implementation of the 25% tariff, which was then repealed for most USMCA compliant goods, and that's a whole other can of worms. Most goods in Canada US trade can be USMCA compliant. Many were not, just because the USMCA compliant rate and the most favored nation trade clause rate were about the same. So uh, there's a technical aspect there that'll have to be sorted out in the coming weeks. But now we're facing steel and aluminum tariffs as well, which are being applied not just to Canada and Mexico, but to all countries that the United States imports from. And coming up on April 2, we're facing a deadline for what the United States is calling reciprocal tariffs against specific industries. So for Canada, that would very likely be dairy and lumber. So many tariff threats flying around. We've seen the markets respond in an unfavorable way to that, although this week they seem to be balancing out a little bit. And in Canada, I think the most interesting part here, Josh, is we've seen this resurgence of nationalism and national pride in response to the tariffs that seems, at least in the polls, to have catapulted the ruling Liberal Party back into contention. Part of that might have to do with your new prime minister. Again, we can talk about that a little bit later on. But I do think a large part of that has to do with the country's response to the United States' tariff threats.
It is quite interesting. I guess it's true what they say that nothing quite unites a people like some kind of external challenge, we could say, right? Because I mean, I'm almost 30, and I've never quite seen a time in my life where Canadians feel so united. That part is true. What you see in the media, Canadians do feel a very strong solidarity right now. And you know when Quebec comes on board, that means something. But interesting within that, Xavi, with all this talk about Canadian pride and the need to kind of safeguard our sovereignty and security. There's also talks about, needing to divest ourselves a bit from the United States in some circles and forge new trade relationships and do it quickly. The thing with this though is, as we both know and as our listeners would know, a massive majority of Canadian trade is with the United States. I think I want to say almost 80%, maybe something like 77%, but we can check that later. How how realistic is it to assume that we can do this? And to what extent should Canada and can Canada forge new trade relationships?
Well, we can certainly undertake efforts to do it. I mean, it's not a novel idea. In the 2010s, we saw Canada try and forge stronger trade relations with China. Of course, that was upended um, by other events, the two Michaels and the subsequent cooling of Canada-China relations. We've tried it with India, of course. Again, also some challenges there with the killing of Canadian Sikhs, allegedly by Indian government agents. Part of the challenge here, Josh, is that the government of Canada can try to set up agreements and trade infrastructure to better facilitate trade between Canada and other trading partners, whether it be in Europe or the Indo-Pacific. But at the end of the day, it's going to be private entities, individuals, small businesses, large corporations that are the ones who are conducting the trade themselves. They're buying and selling goods and services across the border. So the best thing that can do is try and facilitate and create an environment, whether it be through regulation, through agreements, um, that promotes better trade with other partners and tries to diversify Canada's trade base. But it's going to be up to a large slate of individual actors who ultimately decide and dictate how those trade flows expand or contract.
So another point, and you brought it up just a moment ago, Canada's new Prime Minister, Mr. Mark Carney, and for our listeners, once again, um, who may already know, Mr. Carney was governor of the Bank of Canada during the financial crisis of 2008 and beyond. And then, of course, he was chair of Brookfield, uh, Goldman Sachs. He worked there as well. So he's now the prime minister and the liberal leader, and we are likely, as you said earlier, going into an election, maybe within the next few days. Does does the changing of Canada's head of state potentially have the ability to impact bilateral relations in either direction, either positively or negatively? I mean, we all know that Mr. Trudeau's relationship with Trump was not great. Wondering how much bearing that might have on trade, on our relationship more generally.
It could. I think as with any new leader, whether it was Carney, whether they call the federal election and the Conservatives and Pierre Poilievre, or I mean, even the NDP and Jagmeet Singh won. The point is that a new leader who comes in to lead a country is an opportunity to reset the relationship. From what I've seen, Mr. Carney has taken the approach of not going straight to the United States. I mean, as we're talking, he's returning from a trip to Nunavut that was preceded by stops in England and in France to meet with UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer and French President Emmanuel Macron. So he's sending a fairly strong signal that Canada's looking to other allies before it looks to the United States. I read an article today that said Mr. Carney said that he would not visit the United States until the comments about the 51st state and Canada's sovereignty um, stopped. So that's a pretty strong signal to send to the White House. It's worth noting that he is due for an election in relatively short order. Again, he's a prime minister who does not currently hold a seat in parliament, and the prorogation period is expected to end on March 24th, assuming an election is not called before that. But there are a lot of factors in the air here, Josh, that will ultimately impact Mr. Carney's ability to lead the country in negotiations with the United States. Again, he might not be the prime minister when this is all said and done. It might be Prime Minister Pierre Poilievre who has to go down to Washington and negotiate USMCA with Donald Trump. So a lot of factors in the air, but yes, as with any new leader, Mr. Carney's ascendancy to the premiership is an opportunity for us to reset the bilateral relationship. A large part of that will depend on the White House and how they feel about the opportunity, whether they want to take it up or whether they want to continue down their current line of rhetoric. And the only person who can dictate that is the man behind the Resolute desk in Washington.
That's a good point, you bring up. It very well still could be, Mr. Poilievre who takes that visit to Washington, and I actually think, when you and I spoke back in late January, we were talking about Mr. Poilievre as though he was basically certain to become prime minister. I think it's important to note that while right now some polls are showing a liberal victory, it's a very dynamic situation, and the Liberals just about a month ago were at their lowest polling in recent memory, with the Conservatives waltzing to a majority government, and now it looks like the tables are flipped. So, if things that changed that easily and that fast, that quickly, they could potentially change again. So this next election is still worth paying attention to, and we don't really know what's going to happen. Moving on to another topic, Xavier, I don't know to what extent you can get into the nitty gritty of defense procurement projects, but back to that conversation about Canadian pride right now, Canadian unity. There is, as you know, a movement within Canada right now to buy Canadian, to not buy American goods, and I think part of that conversation has seeped into discussion about our defense acquisition projects. So, as you may have seen, in the news, there's now talks and concerns over the F-35 purchase that Canada is supposed to make, I believe, from Lockheed Martin. Their concerns around buying from the United States. Again, curious what you think about this, the feasibility of of reneging on such a contract or trying to pivot towards other suppliers. And then on kind of on the flip side of that, sorry, I'm asking two questions here. There seems to be a couple camps of thought in Canada around this now. There are some that think that we shouldn't buy from the US at this point, and there's others that think Canada might actually have the ability to improve and allay some concerns in the trade relationship if Canada buys more defense equipment from the United States. So I kind of just lobbed three questions at you, but I'm wondering if you might take a stab at that.
Yeah, it goes back to what we were saying at the top of the recording, Josh, which is that a lot of Canadians feel like the United States is not a reliable partner and ally anymore, and that there's a deep sense of, first of all, betrayal, but also now distrust in the bilateral relationship that will extend beyond just the current administration and presidency. I'm not surprised that these defense contracts and procurement are on the table, or that they're being questioned. I will say we spent a lot of money and time and resources going through the review process and approval process for this. I can't comment on whether I think it would be a good or bad decision, but you've correctly identified that this is an ongoing public debate about whether we should be, well, first, that we should be buying military equipment and investing in security projects with reliable allies. And in Canada, that adds to that feeling of whether the United States is can still be considered that towards Canadians. I think this is also happening around the world. We should be talking to our NATO allies about how they're perceiving this. Obviously, the United States wants to push for all NATO partners to spend at least 5% of their GDP on defense. It would certainly help Canada to be spending more on defense. Right now, we're one of the few that spends both below 2% of our total GDP on defense, but also below 20% of that defense spending on new military equipment. So I'm not saying Canada is a perfect partner in that sense, but there are legitimate questions that stem from this new perception of the United States, and the shaking of its usual image as a pillar of military security for Western nations.
Building on that, Zabi, we kind of discussed basically a similar or identical question last time we spoke, but I think it's worth bringing up again because of how much has changed. In the past month and a half or so, we had Vice President Vance's remarks, of course, at the Munich Security Conference. We had the exchange between President Zelensky and Trump in the Oval Office, and we've had some updates in regards to potential peace talks between Russia, Ukraine, kind of brokered in part by the United States. What is, from your perspective or understanding, what is the United States' position vis-a-vis NATO right now? Do you see any changes there? And then maybe what are the implications for countries like Canada, but also for Ukraine?
I don't think it should come as a big surprise. Maybe a surprise in how it all played out, but the rhetoric has always been there. And that rhetoric is that the United States wants to prioritize its jobs and industry and workers at home. It's turning inward to focus on domestic policy and domestic growth. In order to do that, the Trump administration, both to a degree during Trump 1 and especially during Trump 2, has thought that the United States needs to withdraw from its international obligations and commitments. And to do that, it needs Europe, Canada, and its other international partners to shoulder more of the burden in their own backyards. For Canada, that's relevant both because of NATO, but also because of the Arctic, where the United States has made significant investments into NORAD and the Northern Warning System, and has urged Canada to make similar investments to help maintain those security systems. So I expect we'll see that play out in the coming months and throughout the rest of the administration. With specific regards to NATO, um, again, this rhetoric isn't surprising. Canada, the United States and Vice President Vance has said that Europe needs to shoulder more of the burden for defending Eastern Europe and other countries across the region. The U.S. retreat from these areas doesn't strike me as surprising, and I think it's probably indicative of things we'll see going forward around the world where the U.S. is also stationed.
Well, Zavi, thanks for being so generous with your time and thanks for meeting with me. We had a lot to discuss, and you're right, we could probably continue this conversation for a few hours at least. I wanted to ask you before we wrap up if you have any final thoughts or key messaging you'd like to hit home.
No, just that I know it's a very difficult time for Canada. Believe me, as a Canadian, I can feel it. What I've been telling people is that there is no better time right now to educate folks in the United States about Canada, and for folks in Canada to get educated about the United States. It feels weird to frame the current crisis that we're in as an opportunity, but it really is just that. The point that I was talking about earlier, Josh, a lot of Americans don't usually pay attention to Canada. And for the first time, we're seeing Canada US trade negotiations and disputes as front page news on major media outlets. That's an enormous opportunity to tell people about why the bilateral relationship is so valuable. And I hope that even despite the frustration, the anger, and sense of betrayal, we don't squander that opportunity to continue talking about why this bilateral relationship should provide so much value to both Canadians and Americans.
Yeah, I think it's great to leave things off on a bit of a positive note, and I would also just add to that and say Canada for a long time has been talking about needing to safeguard its security and sovereignty a bit more, and it looks like, for better or for worse, this evolutions in our relationship as of late has forced the average Canadian to think a bit harder about sovereignty, to think a bit harder about safeguarding some of our national interests, and I think that's something that Canada had to do, regardless of these developments with our relationship with the United States. And I agree with you. This is just here's to hoping that we can continue educating each other and that we inform people on the importance of the bilateral relationship. Savvy, thanks again for coming on. And to our audience, we had some technical difficulties early on. So Zavi's been very graceful here and sticking with me amidst all that. But Zavi, I'm sure there's going to be more developments soon. So we'll be looking forward to getting you back on the podcast again. And thanks for all the great work you do with the Wilson Center and the Canada Institute. That brings us to the end of this pod. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter and be sure to follow us on your favorite podcast platform so that you never miss an update. For more in-depth analysis and updates on national security and defense, be sure to visit our website at www.cdainstitute.ca, where you can find articles, reports, and more. Thank you for listening, and a big thank you once again to Zavi. We hope you'll be tuning in next time.